In this lesson, you will see me using a lot of references. That's because I want you to see how I interpret what I see into loose shapes. And using this technique, you can do the same thing with any kind of flower you can find, or even make up your own. If you find it very difficult to see things for their basic shapes, check out my quick drawing class that shows you many examples of how to really observe and illustrate anything you want, and then come back and try again. But I believe in you, so just give it a try because it's easier than it looks. Just be loose and playful. Let's start with a simple daisy. Always do one step at a time. So let's start with the center. I start by using the tip of my brush to make lots of little dots, and then I outline them in a loose circle. I'm just observing what I see, the shapes, the shadows, the lights, and I'm interpreting them in my own way and simplifying with loose brush strokes. I add a second color in to make it more interesting while the paint is still wet, and now I have the choice of waiting for it to dry to paint the petals or just painting while it's still wet like I did, which pulls the paint out from the center. This is a personal preference, but I really like the loose look this creates and don't mind the paint mingling. Notice how I paint the petals. I'm using a couple of strokes on each petal because I'm mimicking the likeness of the reference. I'm trying to get the texture and lighting down. It's very important that I leave the white of the page. It makes the piece feel more alive. Without it, it would look flat and lifeless. Also, notice how each petal is completely unique. I'm not really looking at the reference anymore, but it's more like I understand how the petals are. So I'm doing something similar in my own way, and I'm doing each one quickly so I don't think about it too much and overdo them or make them all exactly the same. Just stay loose with it. Also, notice how I don't touch the center in some parts so that color doesn't bleed in. I'm controlling where it does and doesn't bleed, and we'll talk about this more a little later. I continue painting the petals until it's done. That was super simple, and now I know how to paint daisies without a reference. But this process started with me looking at a real daisy and observing it and interpreting it in my own way. But there isn't just one way of interpreting a subject. Everyone will see everything differently and will paint it differently because everyone has their own unique style, and that's a beautiful thing. Let's see how I would paint this rose. But before we start painting, I want you to observe it with me. What I see is a dark center that gradually turns lighter as it goes up. I also see a lot of detail in the center that gets less and less detailed until it turns into big petals. So this is what I will try to paint. I start with a detailed and dark center using the tip of my brush for thin strokes. Notice how it's just lines that are going around a center point loosely, not closing everywhere, and I leave a lot of white space. Then I drop in some dark purple to make it darker, and now I clean my brush until only water is on it, and I start painting thick petals around the center point by pressing my brush down. Because I touch the center, it pulls paint out of it and makes light petals. It's up to you how many petals you want. I just loosely painted a bunch in and left lots of white space between them to show separation. Then I decided to add some pink and dropped it around the rose for an extra pop. Now I do the same thing on the right side of it. Notice how where they touch you can't tell where one rose begins and one ends because I didn't let the previous rose dry first. I also added more dark purple into the center this time, and since the paint is still wet, it will bleed out and it will make more contrast because the darks and lights will be very different. I use the same technique to paint one more smaller rose on the left to balance the composition, and I add a simple leaves by using the technique we went over in the previous lesson. I place them randomly and let them bleed into the rose where they touch for a beautiful effect. And that's it. Now this was one way to paint a rose, but there's plenty of other styles and techniques. Let's see a couple of different ways I painted roses in the past as an example. This one was done similarly to the previous one, but I made my strokes around the center more like half circles. It's more abstract, but it's still recognizable. I made the center a little differently and less detailed. Also, these roses were made with 2 layers, not just one. This one doesn't have contrast. It's just more like a loose rose shape, but it still works. And notice how I made the leaves as outlines for a nice contrast. These roses were more controlled and yet still simple. I did use a darker center, but I made lots of petals in an elegant pattern. These roses, which you will see in a future lesson, are very loose and expressive and don't have that much contrast either. I even put little purple dots in the middle one. Even the roses usually have little yellow dots. But I can take the artistic freedom and do whatever I want with my flowers. And this last example, which you will also see in a future lesson, is very loose and expressive, but still has that soft quality because I layered the details on top of a first layer that's very soft in color. As you can see, one type of flower can be painted in tons of different ways even by the same artist and still be easily recognizable. So don't worry about painting your flowers the right way. There is no such thing. Just play with it and find your own unique style. Now, what do you do if a flower looks complex, like this one? Well, that's simple. Just simplify it. It's really just a pattern, and I painted it by starting in the center and then kept doing the same thing until it got bigger. I also added in some made up leaves and used water to pull color out of the leaves and flower for a loose background. Using water for a controlled bleed is really fun, but it does take experience to know when it's a good idea and when it's not so good. For example, when painting this Cosmo in the first example, I did not wait for the petals to dry before adding the yellow center, and it bled very messily into everything, making muddy colors. It just doesn't look good. So the better way is to first paint either the center or the petals, let it dry completely, and then add the rest. In this example, a little part of the petals was still wet, but I knew that when putting the paint in and wanted there to be a tiny bleed. Look how much better it looks now. Bleeds are super fun, but just be careful not to overdo them and control them. In the end, the truth is loose florals are easily recognizable because our brain is so good on picking up information and finishing the picture. You could literally just paint super messy and loose, and I would still know what you are painting. On some of these, I was more controlled and neat, and on others, I was more messy and wild. But it's very hard to see the difference because all you can see is lavender. You can literally just go loose and crazy and make up weird strokes and not even include stems, and your brain would still pick up that it's lavender. My point is, don't worry so much about it and just let go and do your own thing. Now that you got the basics down of painting from a reference and studying a flower to understand it, and then you can do it in your own way, let's see a few more examples that are more advanced.